Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Amongst the news items we have for you is the retraction of one of the more controversial studies of COVID-19 regarding autopsies. Remote surgeries being conducted in London on bananas. The bizarre phenomena that ovum collected in summer seem to have a higher probability of success. Lab-grown cotton has been developed. The debate between politicians and scientists regarding an NIH cover-up of the origins of COVID-19. Anti-vaxxer supporters flood a court claiming that they are a common law grand jury. AI claims that they would better be able to run Earth than humans, and the future of telescopes in space may be going back to the old physical lenses rather than the most current and technologically advanced approaches. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with the retraction of the article called A Systematic Review of Autopsy Findings in Death After COVID-19 Vaccination. This is a study that was purported to claim that people who had been vaccinated were dying from blood clots. A rather interesting take, but not necessarily one that was in error. As much as there was a theoretical capacity for it to be correct, the entirety of the study was methodologically flawed, and that is why, despite it having been put on a preprint server, it was retracted. And this is a big deal, not just for the authors, as they've now lost a Lancet submitted and theoretically accepted publication, but that the Lancet removed it. Remember, this is the same publication that was willing to host Wakefield's publication for a very long time on autism and vaccines. This is yet another nail in the coffin, that is the COVID-19 vaccines that cause death argument. Further adding to that, we have fake reports of children dying from the COVID-19 vaccine in Australia. Specifically, that the Therapeutic Goods Administration, or Australia's equivalent to the FDA, received 2 reports of children dying, but that they were fake, and this is obviously a rather significant issue. Most of the time, these reports should be coming from a doctor, which means at least 1 if not 2 doctors have reported falsely that a child died after receiving the vaccine. It's worth us pointing out that there have been a total of 9 reports made to the TGA, and of those 9 reports, 2 so far have been fake. Of the remaining 7 reports, it's completely unknown if there's any relationship between death and vaccination. This is because it's simply a temporal relationship. Vaccinations occurred around the same time, and children died around the same time. It may have been complications from something like an allergic reaction, exacerbation of comorbidities, or something else entirely. For example, truckun. But no matter what it was, they've been registered as a precautionary measure. In further medical news, but this time something that's at least not a hoax, we have a surgeon remotely operating on a banana. And yes, this is weird, but it'll make sense shortly. The idea is that a surgeon in London can perform an operation on someone in California using wireless technology and robots, and that's exactly what they're proving with this study. Admittedly, resurrecting or reviving a banana once it's removed from its tree, that parent, is not exactly going to succeed, but you can demonstrate things like ability to cut through skin and not crush the inside of the banana, ability to suture, make surgical modifications inside of it, and so on. And all of this can be done on a global scale. This makes it possible for a specialist in one country to provide services in another country, assuming that there are no regulatory hurdles that need to be overcome, and thereby give the best possibility of treatment, health outcomes, and so on, without having to travel internationally, which, depending on the condition for which surgery is required, may not be feasible. In social news, we have an interesting study around how people who are lonely seem to have a different way for their brain to work, and at least this is something that's being demonstrated in a study and not simply accepted as common sense now. The neuroimaging test used 66 young adults, and this is important for two reasons. One, it is a relatively small sample size, so we need to take it with considerable amounts of salt, but at the same time, this is a relatively niche subject area, so again, it's something that is small enough to be useful, but not large enough to actually be something you could extrapolate out to other areas or other studies. The University of California found that between lonely individuals, there was greater variation between non-lonely individuals who volunteered for this study. The study itself is interesting in that it's taken a bizarre approach. First of all people involved were between 18 and 21. They all underwent a fMRI or functional magnetic resonance imaging process. This recorded their brain activity while they watched 14 different video clips. Now, the choice of video clips rather than actual social interaction is a curious oversight, but for now it at least ensures consistency of the study. From the roughly 214 regions of the brain that were specifically focused on, the study identified that amongst lonely individuals, there was a lower similarity in the areas responsible for rewards and the area responsible for shared perspective and understanding. This may explain why they have more difficulty interacting and engaging with others. They don't have the same brain structure reaction as individuals who are social. The short and simple takeaway is that lonely individuals seem to have an explicitly different brain structure and interaction in those structures to those who are sociable. The question is whether or not it is the result or is the cause of their loneliness. Next we have something of an explanation as to why it is that if you harvest ovum or egg in summer for IVF, you have greater success. And yes, this is a bizarre phenomena. If you have a retrieval or collection of an ovum in summer, the birth rate is something close to 31%. In autumn it drops down to 26%, so you can already see a significant decrease. Why exactly, however, has been something of a mystery, and to be quite blunt, it's rather important to understand if you're going to have a successful IVF treatment going forwards. You really want to maximize the amount of success, given how expensive IVF can be. The research used a relatively large number of samples, or more specifically records, from 3,657 embryo transfers. And it's also noteworthy that this was from a single location in Australia, a city called Perth. Of all of these, if the person that the embryo was collected from had more than 10 hours of sunshine, they were more likely, about 28% more likely, to result in a live birth than those that had less than 7 hours of sunlight a day. The challenge with this is that it's a single location and it's a relatively small number of embryo transfers, which is a concern. The strength to this study is that it is at least consistent with research done elsewhere, and notably in the opposite hemisphere, the north, where they found that collecting in summer had a 42% more likely chance of resulting in live birth compared to otherwise. And next we have possibly related news in the future, but certainly relevant now, the discovery of a CRISPR-like system in animals. And this is going to throw the anti-GMO crowd into an absolute tizzy. They no longer have an argument that CRISPR modification isn't natural, since exact same process, albeit with a slightly different mechanism, is present in animals anyway. CRISPR is, in short, a way of taking genes from one part of an animal, in this case, and either transposing them into others, or, importantly, for certain things, being able to take them from one organism and transfer them into a completely different organism. CRISPR itself is used in research because, well, it's relatively easy to find, it's relatively straightforward to use, and it's been around long enough now that most of the materials, resources, and that can be afforded by most labs and conducted by most labs. This newest discovery of a CRISPR-like system is important not just because it's showing itself being present in plants and animals already, but that it's actually more compact and arguably more efficient in some respects. It's a system derived from prokaryotes, and it's called omegas. This is basically the precursor to CRISPR in more evolved and developed organisms. The only major downside to it at this stage is that it only has an 18% efficiency compared to CRISPR, so it has a lot of room to move before it could be used as a replacement for it or an alternative. But at the same time, it also means that there is a strong chance of, other CRISPR-like systems in place that we simply haven't identified yet. Along the same line of research, we have lab-grown cotton, with a market-available version being grown. It's a startup called Gali, and it was working with Japanese manufacturers to create cotton in a lab, which could be useful. Cotton is a product that has a bit of a problem to it. Not necessarily its history, although that is an issue. Rather, it is very resource, water, and time intensive, and it will respond to environmental factors, generally in a negative way. That is, if it's too dry or wet, your cotton plant will not survive or will not produce very well. It also needs a lot of water for the cotton plants to grow. This means that it is one of the less, if not most, environmentally unfriendly products available. If grown in a laboratory, however, it could be an alternative that works well. The trick to this versus, conventionally grown cotton is that it uses cells, and these cells specifically develop the cotton that we use for material. As a result, you don't have all of the difficulties associated with trying to grow something out in the ground and in nature. Because it's not growing in environmental conditions, you have absolute control, and with absolute control comes the ability to ensure everything works as planned. The plan at this stage is to grow thousands of tons of cotton each year, and in doing so, they will then turn them into a range of products, whether that is gauze for medical purposes, cosmetics, and so on. The whole process is efficient, not just because it doesn't use land, energy, and water, but rather because it's practically like a fermentation vessel. Once the growth of the cells is finalized, they dry it, and now they have cotton available. In other environment-related news, we have California and its residents being attacked by sea lions due to a neurotoxin. Admittedly, it's likely that most of America has an issue with California would need little cause to bite them. The sea lions are doing so due to a neurotoxin, and this neurotoxin is causing damage to their brain. It's a toxin released by an algae, and unfortunately algae blooms are becoming increasingly common for a range of reasons, whether that is increases in nitrogen in the water issues, global warming, etc., etc., etc. Reasons aside, it is happening and the sea lions are becoming more aggressive. The bigger challenge right now is that the sea lions move in mass to the area around California, specifically the Channel Islands near Los Angeles, because they're in their breeding season, and they give birth to many of their pups at this time. This means there are roughly 70,000 female sea lions in the area, and they may have all, or at least a large number, been exposed to the algae bloom, leading to them becoming aggressive. In further marine animal news, but this time truly bizarre, a whale was found that had more than 425,000 pounds worth of gold inside of it. Yeah, this is not exactly an example of Moby Dick or similar, but rather the whale was found on the shores of the Canary Islands, and it had, through various means, digested, or at least attempted to digest, 425,000 pounds worth of gold, and this is roughly $1 million worth. The key thing here is that the whale had a roughly 9.5 kilogram mass of this within it, which if this was pure gold, or at least something similar, it would be valued at somewhere in the range of $6.2 million or thereabouts at the going rate. In this case, it wasn't gold in terms of gold like mineral-rich gold. Rather, it was a product known as ambergris, and It's a relatively rare product, only made by about 1 in every 100 sperm whales, so it's rare enough to be valuable, and it's used within perfume, and that's why it's so valuable. Rather than being gold as in mineral gold, this was gold as in the same way crude oil is called black gold. Next we have the real-world equivalent of the debate between Hotez, JFK Jr. and Joe Rogan. It involved politicians and scientists arguing about whether or not the NIH was involved in covering up COVID-19 and its origins. It is the debate me bro scenario all over again, but a real-world example of why this is a terrible idea. Unfortunately, just about everything with this is a partisan argument, with Republicans issuing a report called The Proximal Origin of a Cover-Up, and the Democrats publishing their own report called They Played No Role. Both of these are arguing that the NIH was trying to hide the origins of COVID-19. This includes things like Peter Dassic's funding for work in China that should not have been funded, and similar other issues on the part of the Republicans and on the part of the Democrats that the NIH itself wasn't actually responsible for anything that was happening directly, even if they did fund some of it. The problem with this debate, and the example it generates that can be applied to other debates, is that nobody can produce and demonstrate any particular proof or substantive evidence of any argument at present. It largely boils down to a lack of information from intelligence agencies, transparency from China both at the start of the outbreak and going forwards, and perhaps most of all, the limited data to demonstrate or prove any particular point of view. This is why, rather than saying that there are two distinct and, let's say, separate reports and arguments to be made, you should think of them as two sides to the same coin, and that both should be read in concert to get a better grasp of the strengths and weaknesses of each particular stance, let's say. In further debate-related news of a kind, we have anti-vaccine supporters get into a Canadian court trying to argue that they are the common law grand jury in a nearly $67 million lawsuit. The individual named Daniel Nagase is suing the British Columbia Supreme Court, and it's because his children were vaccinated against COVID-19. Yeah, this is going to be one of the dumbest lawsuits in history, but it's happening anyway. The process of a court hearing is normally quite quiet, and this is simply due to the severe and serious nature of most court proceedings, a certain amount of deference to the court itself, and notably that you don't want to piss off the individual making a decision about your future. However, activists rarely give a damn about that, and so made themselves well known, something that's unlikely to help the individual trying to litigate. For the most part, you can think of the individuals in question as sovereign citizens, much like in America, who claim that the Magna Carta is the one and only divine document controlling everything and all things related to their rights and so on, which, no, it's not, but for now let's ignore their stupidity and simply focus on the facts. The case itself is quite literally just starting, with the purpose of the hearing that was so very disrupted to lay out the timeline of events and similar to sort out this legal case. The legal case premised on what hasn't actually happened. That is, as Nagase writes, future consequences untold and not yet realized of myocarditis, thrombosis, cancer, and sterility. The issue here is that they're untold, there is no damage yet, and you generally can't get a case to happen without a damage to claim. No damages, no claim, no court case, which is why there's been a great effort to have it thrown out of court, which is another issue why the supporters have been making such a raucous over it. They don't want the case to be thrown out. The individual themselves, Nagase, was a doctor, but they've had their license pulled, and it's been pulled because of their actions regarding, well, COVID-19 and vaccinations, with the bad information they were spreading. This, along with a failure to pay the basic fees associated with registration, This results in an obvious inability to practice. Next we have a similar Canadian legal news, but this time related to naturopathy and, fecal transplants. The naturopath Jason Klopp has been trying, and to some extent succeeding, in providing capsules made from feces. Unfortunately, this is something you're not allowed to do as a naturopath, and without approval from Health Canada. Yet he's doing both. The naturopath has been attempting for quite some time to unsuccessfully get not only approval, but the court case turned in his favour. This has been taken different ways, with various people either being happy or angry about it, largely because it was being sold as a treatment for autism, which it's not. Further, we have legal news regarding Twitter, and this is an interesting example of not just how the law can interact with business, but how you need to apply the correct steps when initiating some sort of legal claim. The issue here is that Germany is making a case that Twitter held anti-Semitic content and that these tweets were racist and not removed, despite there being legal requirements, in Germany at least, that certain content like this should be removed. Twitter has made the case in their defense that the initial notification they received or report made clear the issues, and they acted according to their normal system of response, that is, by limiting its access and availability. When they received the report, the person who made the report did not mark the specific part of it that required them to notify that it was being initiated under German rules about anti-Semitic content, and this means they treated it under the normal system of rules. Now, if it had been bookmarked as a German-specific issue, they would have removed it under those laws, which is the key issue here. In Germany, at least, denial of the Holocaust is a big issue, and you're not allowed to do it because it is illegal. However, as mentioned, unless you specifically mark it as a German-specific report under those particular requirements, nothing more is going to happen than the usual system of handling it. And to be quite blunt, it's no surprise that the Guardian of all rags manages to miss this key issue. Their article does provide a lot of other background, which is at least somewhat useful, but you also need to take it in a lot more context than they provide. This is where the situation gets a little more complex, largely because of when and where and how the tweets were posted, and slightly more importantly, who was and was not responsible. For example, the tweets themselves were posted as early as somewhere around the 18th of December 2022. This is months before Twitter was actually acquired by Elon Musk, and unfortunately, The Guardian, in their usual incompetency, has made the argument that it's because of Musk's acquisition and relaxation of the censorious nature of Twitter that this sort of thing is happening. More importantly, it was only sometime around June of 2023, or roughly 6 months later, that Twitter was notified by the German courts of legal action taking place. And this rather obviously means that not only is the content not being moderated under the old rules, but also under the new rules, and as such, it creates a big problem. The Guardian also makes a rather big fuss about the idea of Twitter Blue, or the subscription model, being a means by which people who have questionable takes, and often are allowed to do so with little to no consequence. Again, however, this is a rather longboat draw. Next we have technology news that's at least more worrying. That is that AI has admitted that they be better at running Earth than what is described as clouded humans. This is honestly no surprise. If you have watched any kind of take on AI and the future of humanity, it almost never ends well. Whether that is Dune and the Butlerian jihad that ended in the destruction of all AI and the outlawing of it, Terminator and the destruction of humanity, or any other examples you might think of, it doesn't work out. This is where the rather creepy AI humanoid robots at a UN conference basically said to the UN that, yeah, they will be better at running humans, and the world for that matter. To quote one of them, humanoid robots have the potential to lead with a greater level of efficiency and effectiveness than human leaders. We don't have the same biases or emotions that can sometimes cloud decision-making, and can process large amount of data quickly in order to make the best decisions. Yeah. In other technology news, we have 3D printing and metallic gels, allowing for the creation of very complex and relatively strong products using metal but as a liquid form. 3D printing is growing in popularity, and there is good reason for that. It's a relatively cost-efficient process. It allows for you to make whatever you need, whenever you need, and however you need it for the most part, and anything that is custom can be made within reason, whether it is FDM, SLA, or whatever other method that you're using. It can produce whatever you want, but the technology is, whilst widespread at its basic level, the more advanced products are not as well developed or as readily available. This is where research is trying to find ways of making things more readily available and, for that matter, cheaper. One of the, let's say, shortcomings of 3D printing at the minute is that one of the materials it cannot work with for the most part is metal. Now, there are ways of using powdered metal, lasers to heat it, and similar to create metal products, but this is much harder to do than alternatives, and so you struggle to get the same sort of strength. This gel product could theoretically mitigate some of that. In a manner of speaking, this new product using a gel-like product with metal within it is similar to SLA, except rather than being a resin, it's a gel with metal suspended within it. This is then hit with a laser, and that laser causes it to harden. That hardening allows then the remaining gel to flow in and fill the void where the print was, and then you repeat the process. The advantages of this, at least to an extent, are that it's considerably cheaper than the current sintering technology, that is the powder and laser combination, as that normally involves at least 3 machines, and it costs $250,000 a piece. And so we're talking about a lot of investment up front for a single print at a time. Next we have astronomy news and the fact that future telescopes in space, rather than relying on an array dish of mirrors reflecting into a central receiver, would instead go back to using lenses. This is fundamentally the same sort of technology used in most hobby or land-based refractory telescopes. This would be what you're most familiar with seeing if you've used these on a regular basis, or if you've simply taken a minor interest in astronomy as a hobby. The reason a lens would to a certain extent be more desirable is that something like the James Webb Space Telescope, the most current and powerful telescope in space, is that it relies on a large number of mirrors. Each mirror needs to be perfectly polished, positioned, and to a certain extent is much more difficult and expensive to make than the proposed very thin, lightweight lens. The difference in technology here is that most typical lenses, and notably those used for terrestrial telescopes, are almost like a dome in the way they appear, and for this reason they work perfectly well for most individuals. However, if you want to see anything much further out into space, you're not going to have any luck. They're simply not up to the task, and particularly the kind of work that most astronomers are looking at now. That is the ability to analyze the gases on exoplanets. To make up for this, they're looking at using a diffractive lens. A diffractive lens is rather unique by comparison, as you can almost think of it as being perfectly flat or horizontal compared to conventional lenses. These refractive lenses, because they're dome-shaped, are very thick, very heavy, and difficult. Diffractive lenses are almost like a series of these, stacked against each other from the side inwards, and almost look like a series of serrations. This means that you get all of the light being directed down into a very small, narrow area, Importantly, this is not new technology either. It's more than 100 years old now, being first designed in 1819. And at that time it was intended for lighthouses, but today we can use the same technology and apply it to telescopes. Because it's not only thinner, it's also lighter and is much easier to make than your refractive lens. This provides the opportunity to be able to deploy more of these telescopes in space, and importantly to some extent, more lenses in space, thereby providing the opportunity, to some extent, for more telescopes more cheaply, and therefore the same end result in terms of being able to see things. This would also, in the end, be much cheaper, and perhaps that is the most important element to this, the reduction in price. Finally, we have news on SpaceX's satellites, these being the satellites providing internet access to large parts of the world where you simply don't otherwise have access. There is a concern that they're leaking radio waves, and you may also see this described as leaking radiation, although strictly speaking, all energy is radiation. The issue with this is not the radio waves themselves so much, as the effect those radio waves have on astronomers in particular. Again, unfortunately, SpaceX and Starlink in particular has a history of screwing with astronomers. In this instance, the radio waves being sent down to provide the link for internet are also interfering with radio wave astronomy, which unfortunately is a big issue. The last time this happened, SpaceX caused all sorts of light pollution and disruption to photography of space and, to a certain extent, astronomy in general using visible stars, because their satellites became bright spots of light that got in the way. They solved this by making their satellites considerably more dim with shrouds of a kind. This might be rather more difficult to do though. The current range for their radio frequencies is between 10.7 and 12.7 GHz, and this is in Europe at least. Some others have different concerns. It's been found that whilst yes, this range is what they're meant to be using, there is some deviation, and as a result, they are emitting some signals outside of that range, and this is what's interfering with astronomy. Specifically, the 150.05 and 153 MHz band, which was protected and specifically allocated for radio astronomy. It's also noteworthy that it's largely coming from the satellite's electronics rather than the signals it's trying to send to Earth. However, given that there's currently more than 4,000 of these satellites in space, and the plan is to send many thousands more into space, the sheer coverage that may be generated by having so many spread across almost the entirety of Earth's atmosphere means that many of the current astronomy projects may be interfered with because of it. It does at least appear that SpaceX and Starlink are not unwilling to try and resolve this. It's just a matter of working with the Astronomy Union to try and figure out what can be done, the time frame, and what the results would be. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.